So
Hi.
we are continuing our discussion, our leisurely discussion of science and religion. You know, when I've taught this in the past, I've taught it as one session, I've taught it as three sessions. I think we are officially on our fifth or sixth session tonight, and we will have more. And you know, to very briefly summarize where we are, I often speak of two leaps of faith, at least in my own spiritual journey. Leap of faith number one is there a God? And by God in that statement, I mean an organizing intelligence in the universe. And so we spent several sessions really just talking about the evidence from cosmology and biology of an organizing intelligence. And you know, my favorite way of summarizing it was a quote, I think it's from a physicist, saying that the likelihood that the universe turned out to be as hospitable as it is to human life is equivalent to a tornado blasting through a junkyard and producing a fully operational 747. So
Whoa.
that's his assessment. I actually think it's far less likely than that, if I understand the mathematics correctly. So for me, I would say there's a to put it mildly, a wealth of evidence for the existence of an organizing intelligence in the universe that I will call God. And then the second leap of faith that I keep coming back to is, does God care? Does this organizing intelligence in the universe care whether I had a Seder? Does it care whether I eat, you know, a English muffin or matzah with my breakfast? Care whether I'm kind to children or whether I torture children? Um, that, I, for the most part, I would argue is a leap of faith. And we talked about how if God cares, the evidence for that caring should be would 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 be what religions call scripture. So we talked about how we understand scripture and the different ways we can read scripture, you know, reading it literally, uh, reading it allegorically, reading it as a hint, secret readings that are just, you know, in the calligraphy and the numerical values of the text. So we began that discussion last time, and this time I want to probably overdo one of the things I often talk about, which is the only example from the world of science that I can think of that speaks to God's caring. Um, and just to give it away, it's the solar eclipse. Here's a T-shirt I bought when I went to the eclipse. It's probably
Look
seven
at
or eight
that.
years
Oh,
ago.
look at that.
So I'm wearing it tonight. So it is the solar eclipse. I'm going to talk more about that. Um, and people will often say to me things like, "Look how beautiful the flowers are, or the fish, you know, in an aquarium are, and they're so beautiful. That must be God, you know, giving us this gift of beauty." And while I won't say I will never argue with them. It depends on this on the circumstance. I would rarely argue with that. I also, as a scientist, would have to say, you know, the beauty of flowers is a part of natural selection, you know, Darwinian natural selection. You have a pretty flower here, you have a plain flower here. The bees are going to go to the pretty flower. There'll be more pollination, so the pretty flower will promulgate. And even sometimes I just bought this thing. I saw this. Hang on. I saw I saw this thing on Facebook for $50. And as is often the case on Facebook, when you see it for $50 on Facebook, if you then go to Amazon, you will find it a lot less. So this is a sand. I don't know if yeah,
Oh,
I
look at that.
don't know how well you can see that,
Yeah,
but it's
good.
one of these things where you might even be able to see the sand slowly. The background
Right.
it probably isn't right. So it's one of these things. There's bubbles in there, but look how beautiful it is. So you
Yeah.
would argue that someone must have designed this to be so beautiful, but in fact, it's just physics. You know, you just turn it upside down and the sand goes, and it forms a different pattern every time, and it has to do with the various densities of the sand and so on. So there's a lot of beauty, which I would say is not is hard for me to make an argument as a scientist that that really is a gift from God. But the counterexample I have is from is the solar eclipse. Whoops, I lost you. Hang on, I can't do it like this. Hold on. Okay, so I'm going to go to screen share, and I want to do this. Whoa, huh? I want to do it, but I also want to. There we go. Share sound. Maybe even optimize for video sharing. We'll see how this works. Okay, I presume you can see it. Yes? No? Hello?
Yes, I can see
Anybody
it.
there? Yeah, I have completely lost you all now. Starts to make me crazy. Screen share.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. The problem is I can't see any of you.
We haven't lost you,
Yeah, I
at
understand,
least not your voice.
okay, I don't know what happened to you all. Okay, so I'm gonna try and do this again. Maybe it's
By going back into the view box.
no, trust me. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing. There you all are again. I'll try sharing again, doing it a slightly different way. Let's see. Okay, so I presume you can still see it now?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay, so hopefully you'll be able to see it. There's one element in here which is a YouTube clip with the narration. Actually, there's two YouTube clips. Okay, so then I'm going to also go to. Okay, good. I got you. So you see the eclipse, right?
Yes.
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
very.
So this is a composite. I was in Oregon to see the eclipse 7 or 8 years ago. I rented the hotel room like a year and a half early. They still tripled the prices, and we were right in the middle of totality. So this was a guy standing next to me who had all kinds of equipment. But the thing that's astounding about the eclipse and awesome, and as I hope you know, I don't use that phrase lightly. The thing that's so awesome about the eclipse is as you watch it, let's just go around in this direction. You know, you're seeing the sun. And of course, to see the sun, you've got to wear protective glasses. And then slowly, the moon starts coming in place of the sun, right?
Right.
And what is just so powerful to see in person is that the size of the moon, the angular size of the moon, is exactly the same as the size of the sun. So here's just before totality. At totality, the amount of light that you have sort of sitting around is equivalent to a full moon. The guy that took these was a serious photographer, and we had a lot of discussion about it. So this was awesome, and I've actually done this in a couple of sermons, and I think I figured out a way to do this in PowerPoint. We'll see how this works. So here's the basic geometry. You've probably seen this kind of thing before of an eclipse. Here's the sun. There's the moon. The moon is between the sun and the earth, and there's a shadow on the that's formed, of course, and the shadow just barely hits the earth. If the moon were out over here, namely, if the moon were a little further away from the earth, then there would be a bright ring of fire around the sun. It's called, actually, we do see that. I would guess it would be every other annular eclipse because the moon's orbit is not perfectly circular. So you'd see a ring of fire. And if the moon were closer to the earth, the shadow would be bigger and it would block out the corona. So you wouldn't see this beautiful array of a corona. So I was trying to figure out how I can display how unlikely this coincidence is. Because what's going on is the sun is 400 times larger than the moon, but the moon is 400 times closer to the earth than the sun, so it is a perfect balance. And I'll probably say this over and over again. There's no reason for that balance. I mean, there's reasons why this sand thing came out so beautiful. It's just physics.
Right, and
And
come
there's
here.
and there's reasons why there's, the flowers are beautiful and all kinds of other things. But there's no reason why the sun and the moon should be configured this way to create a total eclipse that is just so astoundingly awesome and beautiful. In fact, as we talked about when we were talking about the astronomy of the moon is a far larger satellite compared to the host planet than any other satellite surrounding any other planet. Okay, so I have a couple of other things to see. Okay, so here's my scale model of an eclipse, okay? You have to help me and use your imagination a little bit. So we're going to do a model where 1 foot equals 1,000,000 miles, okay? That's the scale for those of you. Jim, I'm so happy your jaw is dropped for this so far the entire session. So to give you a sense of the scale, I think most of us know, well, maybe the baseball fans know, the distance from home plate to first base is 90 feet, right?
Right.
So at this scale, that's going to represent 90 million miles. The actual distance from the Earth to the sun is about 93 million miles. So it's pretty close, okay? So now this is my first and only actual use of AI in my life for a purpose. I actually had AI, I asked it to give me a picture of a first baseman holding a volleyball, okay? Because the sun's diameter is a little bit less than 1,000,000 miles. So by this scale, it should be about 10 inches. And that's roughly the size of a volleyball. Okay, everybody with me so far?
Right.
Okay. And Henry, Henry, you saw me actually do this in person last year in Merced. And
Yes.
I'll probably do it in Camarillo this year.
Nice.
Okay. So now, here is my high-tech scale model of what's going on with the moon's orbit. So the moon's orbit is about 324,000 miles away from the Earth. That's the diameter of the moon's, I don't know if it's the radius of the diameter. That's actually an important difference. I have to double check that. But in any event, it's about 3 inches. So it's about the top of a pickle jar. Pickles being a very Jewish food. So that's the connection here. I wish these were kosher pickles, but it is Mount of Olives, which is a very important place in Jerusalem, right next to the Temple Mount. So the moon is orbiting the Earth at a distance of about 324,000 miles. The Earth's diameter is about 8,000 miles, which would be about 2.5 millimeters. Okay? And then there's the moon. The moon's diameter is about 2,000 miles or 0.6 millimeters. And a lot of really fine mechanical pencils have a 0.7 millimeter diameter, if that means anything to you. Okay, so here's my model. So here's the first baseman holding a volleyball. I don't know if you can see that, but no reason you have to see it. And here we are at home plate with this little thing in my hand. So it's lining up. We're sitting on the Earth. It's lining up the moon to just cover that volleyball. Is everybody with me on this? How astounding it is that it ever happens. And I tried to just do a couple of other ways of illustrating this. The other thing is, that blackout, I should go back to here. It's only a small spot on the Earth that actually sees the eclipse. So here's a map of the eclipse that's going to be taking place next year. It's going to actually go through near the Arctic Circle and actually go into Europe and into Spain. And that's the width of the shadow. And of course, as the moon circles the Earth, the shadow will move across the Earth. So it's a fine point. And in fact, here's the path across the United States in 2017. And if you really want to see the eclipse, you want to get close to the center of this path because that's where the eclipse is the longest. and you want to be in a place where it's clear. This, and I know it's may not be so easy to see, but this was, I just took a frame of an animation of how the shadow of the moon would appear at a given moment. And this is actually an eclipse that I might be interested in going to see in 2 years, because it's actually going to go through Morocco. And so I just found out about this today. So it just how amazing it is. And I'm going to have you indulge me, because I'm going to show you a little bit of a video. I think it's only about 2 minutes or so of, I think this is the 2017 eclipse that went through Oregon. Actually, you can hear me over the music, right?
Yes.
Okay. Just sitting and watching it slowly cover is just astounding. And we were out in the field like this, actually at a motel, and there was a guy with a super camera. Of course, this is taken with a filter, but once the moon's shadow is complete, you don't need to use the glasses because there's so little light, it's not dangerous at all.
There we go.
But as long as it's even a little bit, you need it. Now watch what happens.
Corona.
Once it covers, then the lens is opening up.
Whoa. Wow.
So this is what it looks like.
How long is it?
The totality on this one, I think, was a little less than 4 minutes. It can be as long as 6.5 or 7 minutes. And if it's cloudy, you completely miss it. I mean, it goes from daylight to the equivalent of a full moon, but that's the risk you take. One of the things that's kind of interesting, a little dramatic here, you can actually see solar flares here. I'm going to show you a close-up of that. And you can see stars.
Middle of eclipse.
I'm going to go forward a little bit. Now, if you try and photograph it without special equipment, this is what it looks like in a photograph. It's like photographing a full moon. But it is astounding.
Comes again.
And now the moon is going to start, it's basically continuing its path.
Wow.
So what was really funny about being there, this was in Madras, Oregon, which has a population of, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20,000. They estimated like about 200,000 people converged on Madras. And what I thought was the funniest thing, of course, we're all excited, and early in the morning, it was kind of hazy and cloudy and everybody's worried, but sure enough, it cleared up. And of course, when we got to totality, everybody started cheering and clapping. And then when it left totality, we started seeing the sun again, people clapped, but instantly you could hear thousands of people starting their cars to try and beat the traffic.
Oh.
And, and of course, there was a partial eclipse now for another hour and a half or so. And Sonia and I stayed an extra night there just because we didn't want to fight the traffic home. Whoops.
Wow.
Okay. So this is actually from my nerd friend taking photos. And so this is generally a picture of the corona. This is like, just barely showing the disk of the sun. And I don't know if you can see it, but if you blow these pictures up, you can actually see solar flares that are actually quite tight because the magnetic field of the sun and the gravitational field of the sun, probably the gravitational field of the sun.
You see it on the bottom picture.
Yes. And it's just fantastic. So that's what I would say is the only evidence of God's caring. I'm just very curious. I want to take a poll. How many of you think would agree with me that that's an evidence of God's? So my point is, there's no reason from science or physics or anything else why this should happen. The moon just happens to be the right size, orbiting the Earth. There's no reason. And in fact, as time goes on, because of friction And the friction is probably mostly in the tides, because the moon affects the tides on the Earth, and the tides use energy. So that energy is going to come out of the Earth-Moon system. So the distance from the Earth to the moon is going to change. And, I don't know how many thousands of years from now, but we'll lose it. So I absolutely see this as a gift from God. I'm just curious, how many of you agree with me on this? I'm curious okay, so we have a couple. We have a couple. Oh, good. I'm glad I took the time to do this, because I have found it amusing that I've been able to convince very few people of this. Alan, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I can get to that through 2 or 3 steps. I believe that what this shows is that wherever there's a sun and there's a planet, and the planet has moons, that there's the same kind of phenomenon in our solar system or in other solar systems. The part that I'm trying to work with on the God caring is, to best we know, we are the only humans who experience the physics of the moons rotating around.
Oh, no. So I didn't make it clear enough. The reason we can see this corona is because the angular size of the moon that we see from the Earth is precisely and exactly the same as the angular size of the sun.
Mm.
If the moon was more like a typical moon of another planet, it would be 5 to 10% of this size.
Right.
And because the sun is so bright, you wouldn't even see it cross the sun.
Well, I'm making an assumption that there are the connections of the moons, planets, and the suns happen, but the miracle, if you can call it that, that God wants us to experience this because we humans are related to this idea of God.
But what I will say is, if you put humans on any other planet in the solar system, you would never have an eclipse like this.
I'm making a different assumption, so you know more. So I accept.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's so astounding is how it perfectly matches up, even though I'm standing, at home plate with this thing, and the sun is, 93 million miles away, and the moon is a lot closer, and they overlap exactly. And that's what allows, this beautiful image of the corona. Okay, so I hope at least that's understood. Any other questions, comments on the eclipse? Okay, we're going to move on to something actually much more troubling, because one of the elements that I raised at the beginning of this discussion is, great, we have a God. We think that God organized the universe, and think of the power of organization skills to set all these things in motion, and to choose exactly the right value for the gravitational constant, for the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, electromagnetic force, and all the other forces, and even the ratios of the forces. And we saw, I see, even Stephen Hawking said that if the velocity of expansion at the Big Bang were 1 part in a million greater, so if it would have been increased by 1/1,000,000th, there would be no suns and no planets and no elements in the universe other than hydrogen, because the velocity of expansion would overcome any gravitational attraction that allows stars to form. Basically, the balance is just right so that stars form. Inside the stars, the heavier elements are made, and so we have something other than hydrogen in the universe. And I think his quote was, if the velocity of expansion were 1/1000th slower, then the Big Bang would be followed by a big crunch. That the gravitational attraction of everything would overcome the inertia of expansion, and we also wouldn't have an interesting universe. We would have one great black hole, and there might be interesting things going on inside that black hole, but we certainly wouldn't be around to examine it. So so now the question is, think about this God, okay, this astoundingly incredible God, who presumably also cares. So if all that's true, how is it that there is tragedy and evil in our world? And that there, in the world of theology, there is a particular name to this question, and the name to that question is theodicy. So theodicy, it's funny, I can't entirely see this. The something of evil, or the question probably,
Problem of evil and
the
tragedy.
problem of evil and tragedy. So I'm actually going to spend some time on evil and also spend some time on tragedy. So for one thing, evil is horrible, but I would argue that it's simply a consequence of human free will. You know, when I was wearing for a very long time a yarmulke all the time, people would stop and ask me questions. That was actually the reason why I wore a yarmulke. I wanted people to stop and ask me questions about Judaism. And I remember once on the plane, someone asking me, you know, saying, you know, you're a religious Jew and so on. So the question that they asked was, where was God at Auschwitz? And in my opinion, that's the wrong question. The question was, where was humanity at Auschwitz? And we're going to go over in some detail an experiment called the Milgram experiment, which addresses this question of basically the human propensity to do horrible things. Yeah, Alan, go ahead.
Well, I would add, I disagree with you wrote about evil, but does natural disasters like serious earthquakes that kills lots of people, isn't that evil? Or do
That's
you
tragedy. So this is my definitions.
People or
Evil, I would, the way I'm defining it, you can define it any way you want.
Okay.
I'm defining things that are a result of human choice, evil, and things that are terrible things that occur outside the realm of human choice, tragedy. So, clearest example of evil is the Holocaust. But, you know, lynchings, just bullying, you know, you can go from, there's clearly a huge scale of evil. And tragedy would be earthquakes and tsunamis and cancer and Huntington's disease and you know, basically what insurance companies like to call acts of God, but presumably things where we would say it's hard to detect human free will in them. You know, you can have cancer because someone smoked all their life. So it's, you know, it's not always completely clear cut, but, you know, childhood cancer. It's, you know, this analysis comes from Harold Kushner. His son was born with a horrible disease called progeria. So it's hard to imagine anything that a human did that would result in his son having progeria.
Right.
And so I would say evil is a consequence of human free will.
Okay.
In theory, I guess you could say, and maybe people would wish, that God would have made us, humanity, incapable of evil. We're incapable of stopping breathing. We're incapable of flying, you know, unassisted. So presumably, God could have made the world perfect. I think most of you have heard me talk about this before, and God could have made us incapable of evil. And then the question is, would that have resulted in an interesting world? Or maybe that's the wrong way to pose it. If we were incapable of evil, would we have any moral significance? I would argue that lima beans are incapable of evil. I think even animals presumably do what they need to do to survive. I don't think they hatch evil plots. But certainly, if you look into a Kabbalistic understanding of the universe, of God, the idea is that God shows us to be partners in tikkun olam, in the perfection of the world. So if we need to perfect the world, there has to be problems with the world, and so we can choose, you know, to build gas chambers, a la the Nazis, or hospitals. But the free choice is us. I'm going to talk more about free will in a second. Paul.
Yes, I'm just wondering if we can make this a little simpler by saying God made us with 23 chromosomes. That's all he did. He let the chromosomes do what they're going to do. He didn't make us have each disease on the chromosome itself. He just started with a chromosome and that's it. Maybe that's what happened.
Yeah, I would say there's a lot more going on because as the text says, and I think we talked about this early on, maybe not, or maybe it's coming, that God said, let us make humanity in our image. So I would say God made us both in the image of animals, 23 pairs of chromosomes,
Right.
with thousands of genes. But also we have a sense of divinity within us.
Right.
And I would say Judaism would argue that that is a uniquely human part of it. So the question, so I would say evil is a consequence of human free will. And there's a wonderfully puzzling mention in the Mishnah, in the Pirkei Avot, which says everything is foreseen, yet free will is given. So this is kind of puzzling. The question is, does God know the future? That's the question. Does God know the future? If God knows the future, do we really have free will? If God knows what I'm going to do I really have free will?
In that case, you don't. It doesn't.
Okay,
Really
that's but the Mishnah says free will is given. So the way I like to understand it, as I think through this, and I think about it a lot, is God has a view of time. God knows what's going to happen, but inside time, we have free will. And the way I like to think about it is imagine, the classic, Friday the 13th, version 14. And the sweet young things are walking in the woods, and behind one of the doors in the house is this guy with a hockey mask and a chainsaw and getting ready to kill all these sweet young things. And they walk into the house, and you've seen this movie before, right? So
Yes.
Don't pick the center door. Don't pick the center door. That's where this guy is hiding. But you're still caught up in it. Inside the movie, the actors have free will, but because the movie is fixed, it's already on film and it's done, we know how the movie is going to end, right? So this is my way of understanding this. God has seen the movie of our lives and everything else. God has a view outside of time. So God foresees things, but we have free will. And a classic example of this, well, let me not get into it, but that's the way I understand it. Jim.
I've heard, I'm confused now because I've heard you say that if God knew what was going to happen in the future, Genesis 6:6 would be different.
It says it does say God. Well, I was going to go there. It says that Genesis 6:6, which is just before the flood, it said God regretted having made humankind, and it pained God to see how people turned out.
Wow.
So presumably, and there's actually in the Talmud, there is actually an argument between God and the angels. This is actually in the Quran, and it's also in rabbinic literature, where the angels are trying to convince God not to make humanity. And they're arguing people are going to be rotten, and they're going to steal, and they're going to sin, and they're going to do all this other stuff. But God says, yeah, but they'll sin, but they have the power of redemption, and they're going to, So I would say God did know, Jim, that humanity would turn out this way, but God still either took a chance on us or knows that in the future, presumably things will get better, or maybe not. I don't know. But that's how I don't believe God foresees. I don't believe God is omnipotent, and I'm not sure about omniscient. But also, I don't necessarily place supreme reliance on every verse of the Bible. So, there's a lot of places in the Bible where God seems to be only human. Joanne.
So, when I think about God, I just see, for me, it's him as like a positive force.
Right.
I just don't think he can control all the events or people's behavior, but
Yes.
I believe he puts out like a positive energy. you know,
Yeah,
to
and
try.
I absolutely agree with you. And I think about it as a teacher. I
Yeah,
mean, I guess I'm being an old physicist, still stuck with the idea that I know what energy is, and I don't mean by energy what you mean by energy,
right.
Joanne.
I know. I
Um,
understand.
but I think of God as being a teacher and teaching what we should be doing,
Right,
and we have the free will to obey that teaching or disobey the teaching.
right.
Otherwise, there would be no such thing as sin. There would be no such thing as punishment. Less.
Then a question I have in Judaism, because I'm not sure exactly how we perceive heaven. in We do believe in heaven, is that correct?
If you ask, the question is, what do Jews believe about heaven? And my response is, I don't know. Go ask them. Judaism has teachings about heaven, but I know many Jews who don't believe in heaven and hell. But Judaism absolutely teaches that there is something, some form of life beyond our current life, and that there is reward and punishment in that life.
Well, because what I'm thinking is, I have trouble if God is a loving God, which I believe he is,
Mhm.
how can he create, and let's just say Christianity has it right that there is a hell and a heaven, and God creates, say, me, I'm an evil, horrible person, and I'm going to be condemned to hell for eternity. Why would a loving God create me in the first place?
So the answer, which is what we're getting to, is God created you with free will. And God does not control whether you're a good person or a bad person. And one response is, how is then God just? And one response is, you will get your reward or punishment in the next life.
Yeah, but I mean, we have no concept of, if we do bad things here, if we knew that we would spend eternity in hell or something, nobody would do anything if we knew that.
That's
But
why,
we
you
have
know, when you,
Gehenna. We have Gehenna.
well,
which-
hold on, slow down a second. But you heard me talk about the police car example, that if we were certain of that belief, I agree with you. I think if we were certain about reward and punishment, we would lose free will. So therefore, if God wants us to have free will, God builds us with doubt and struggle. And so we're Israel, people who struggle with God. I agree with you. If we were certain, I mean, when you're driving down the freeway at 75 miles an hour and you see a highway patrol car in the next lane, you slow down, right?
Right.
Right. Because you don't want to get a ticket. So if you really thought that God was literally watching your every step and was going to smack you down either in this life or in the next life, you wouldn't sin. So you would lose free will. And I would say that an essential part of being human is having free will.
But then when we die, and if we go to what we call heaven, we won't have free will because everything will be quote unquote perfect. And that's what
God knows. I'm not
No,
going to
I'm
go there
saying
because I have no idea.
that's a Christian belief. If I'm not, I think Jim is. Isn't that a Christian belief?
I'm not going to even go to Christian beliefs, but certainly Judaism has a concept of a place of reward
Right.
and a place of punishment, as Jerry was saying, Gehenna. And there's some interesting teachings about Gehenna, which is a Jewish concept of hell. And then there's also the mystics believe in reincarnation, that we come back, and that if you're born with some kind of horrible disease, it may be because of sins you committed in a prior lifetime.
Well, in Judaism, can we get out of Gehenna? Can we be
So
good?
in Judaism, the medieval teaching is that Gehenna is a maximum period of 1 year.
Oh, okay.
And you get off for Shabbat. So on Friday night, don't ask me what the time zone of Gehenna is. I don't have any idea. But Friday night, you leave and you go to snowy areas to cool off from the fires of Gehenna. And then at Havdalah, those sulfurous furnaces are relit. That's why we have a spice box at Havdalah, so we don't smell the sulfur. And we're back in. And then there's also a teaching, which you will enjoy, that the punishments of Gehenna fit the crimes. So, for example, people who are vain about their hair will be hanged by their hair as a punishment. People who committed gossip will be hanged by their tongues in Gehenna. And
Oh.
one can only imagine what the punishment for sexual crimes might be. But it's a maximum for a year, but there are several crimes or sins that can condemn you to eternity in Gehenna. One is trying to pronounce God's actual name. And I've done that so many times that I'm lost. Another is humiliating other people, in particular by calling them nasty names. You can actually spend eternity in Gehenna.
Just a
Now,
political statement you
I
make?
can't think of anybody who routinely calls people demeaning or nasty names, but my imagination isn't that good. So I mean, these are all medieval teachings. Unless one of the huge differences between Judaism and Christianity is in Judaism, the focus is not what you believe.
It's what you do.
The focus is what you do. Stick to the matzah this week, okay? You can 7 levels of heaven, Gehenna punishment, hanging by your tongue, whatever, God knows. But boy, if you have, that chocolate cake, that's a problem. Alan.
Made with
So I'm trying to frame a question that there's some things we believe or understand, and there's things we don't understand. So the part that I'm trying to convey has to do with I believe that God created the universe and the world and all the things that we understand. We're trying to understand the intention. And here's the part, briefly as I can, the part is that God decided that the master plan would include humans with free will, and it would be guided by the practices of the Torah, let's say it that way. And therefore we would become good, we would behave in a good or bad way, even with free will, if we follow the guidance of our teachings that were given to us at Mount Sinai for this purpose. That's kind of my way of trying to explain that part, but does not at all touch on the why did God do this. But
So again, just back to this presentation, I'll read from a section that we read on Yom Kippur, the Torah reading. And it's this day I call the heavens and earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life that your children may live. So clearly the Torah is saying it's up to you to choose. God is not going to force us. And so then, we delve into the mind of God, which we should understand. We limited humans can't quite appreciate the total mind of God. So the question is, why did God create a world that is imperfect and put people who are created in the image of God with free will to do good things or bad things? That's actually I'm going to actually talk more about that. Probably I won't get to it tonight, but I definitely will pursue it, because this question of theodicy is the animating question of my rabbinic life, given the tragedy that happened to my wife and now my children. So the question is, how do you reconcile a powerful, loving God with these kinds of tragedies? So as I say, evil, I think, is pretty simple. Tragedy is a larger problem.
I think about that a lot, Rabbi, because of my medical condition.
Of course.
But I think I've said this before. I always I think about Hashem, even sometimes when I go for testing, when I'm on the table having an MRI or a CT scan, I just close my eyes and I say, please, Hashem, just make me comfortable and let me get through this quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And I just do what I have to do, and that's it.
I'm
But
with you.
it's hard.
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
And what you said, where did this come from? I don't know. I've even asked my doctors, if we could do genetic testing to look at the DNA, and she said it really won't show anything. You're not going to know. So, I just try to move forward, but it's very overwhelming at times. The weekend was very difficult for me because of medication. I've been losing some hair. So I'm trying something now to see if I can get some of it back, and we'll see what happens. But it's
Mhm.
very scary, you know, and I'm like, where is Hashem? I mean, he can just help
Yeah,
me
yeah.
be positive, and figure out ways to move forward in a good way, you know?
Yeah, I am absolutely with you. And so I have to say, with Huntington's disease, we know the DNA.
Okay.
And so now the question is, can that knowledge of the underlying DNA help with treatment? And the answer is not so far.
No,
So
the DNA will only tell you who is carrying it, if I'm
yes,
correct.
well, but also it tells you which gene has
Yeah,
which mutation. And now the
right.
question is, with gene splicing and with
Yeah,
other ways of treating it, can we figure out a way to interfere with the mutated gene? So
right.
DNA does help, Les.
Yeah, I had a young lady who worked with me back in 1979, 1980. And in 1980, on February 29th, she found out she had leukemia. And to make a long story short, they gave her about 6 months to live. And she lived, I think, till December 21st of 81. So she lived about 18, 19, 20 months. And about 6 or 7 years later, I was with a dear friend of mine, and we were at a baseball game in Arizona, spring training. And I was with the oncologist who took care of the gal that worked with me. And you know what he said? He said, if she had the situation today, we could have saved her and had no problems. That's where that shows the hope. That's the hope we can.
So what I see that from a theological point of view is that God begs us to use our intelligence and our resources to cure. We have the technology to build knives, to make this very simple. Knives can stab people and torture people, or knives can be scalpels to heal people. So what I would say is God teaches us to heal and gives us the intelligence to keep doing research, as this oncologist was saying, to do better. But it's up to us as to, are we going to use our resources to build bigger and better bombs, to build concentration camps and prisons, and to torture people? Or are we going to use our resources to help people? That's our free will. God begs us, in the words of Deuteronomy, to choose life, but God doesn't force us to do it. So
What's the two? I can't think of the terms. Oh, one is evil and one is good. You know
so
what I'm
I'm
talking about?
evil and tragedy. So
No, well, yes, but there's an expression in Hebrew. It's with a
tov
Y.
tov ra. Yetzer tov, the
Yeah,
inclination toward good, and
yes,
Yetzer hara,
Oh,
which is sometimes called the inclination toward evil, but it's
right.
really the inclination, I would say, toward greed, because it's necessary, and that's a whole other thing that we get into this, and that there's a story in the Talmud that the rabbis trapped the evil inclination, the Yetzer hara.
Right.
So, and they kept it under control. So no one had any sexual urges. No one had any desire to make money, because they had no selfish or self-serving desires. And they say, in the Talmud, even the chickens stopped laying eggs, and basically humanity stopped moving. And the rabbis asked God, can you just give us a weakened version of the Yetzer hara? And God said, no, basically take it or leave it. And so they reluctantly released the Yetzer hara. So it's not only sort of pure evil, it's selfishness. I would say most people that I would describe as evil, I would say that we would all describe as evil. I'm pretty sure we would all agree Hitler is evil. I don't think Hitler would describe himself as evil. I would say Hitler thought he was going to, have a rebirth of Germany and going to have ethnic cleansing to make a new Aryan super race. And what he was doing, I'm sure he thought he was doing for the good of Germany. So it's anyway. I don't know if that's helpful at all. Okay, let me go on a little bit. So as I say, tragedy and human suffering for me, is the more difficult theological question. So remember, I introduced a book by Spitzer, which is called New Proofs of the Existence of God. And I just have two quotes that I found helpful as I was reviewing things to prepare for this discussion. He said, there can be little doubt that the primary reason for atheism is the inability to answer the question of human suffering. And he says, and I knew him as he grew older, I would see him at conferences, and he was blind. You know, last time I saw him speak, he had a guy who would basically lead him to the speaker's podium, and he was debilitated. And so he had some real challenges in his life. I don't know. Well, anyway, so here's the quote. It was only when I was challenged by real suffering that I began to ask more probative questions, to search for the deeper purpose in life, and to let go of what was then manifestly superficial under living my life. And I have to say it's true of my own life. I mean, that's before I had the kinds of tragedy that my family faced. I wasn't a bad person, but I certainly wasn't involved in this kind of work. Okay. You know what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a video of the Milgram experiment. First, let me ask, how many of you are familiar with the Milgram experiment?
A little bit.
Remember.
Okay. So I talk about this a lot. And basically the question is, do ordinary folks like you and me living in this case, Milgram did his work in New Haven, Connecticut, have the power of really inflicting horrible things on other people? In a way, the issue, and you'll see this video starts out with images of Nazi Germany. With the Nazis, with the Nazis and the Germans that ran concentration camps and so on, were they some kind of uniquely mutated form of humanity that had, overwhelming Yetzer Hara or evil impulses, or not? And Milgram did this experiment. So here's a video. And I guess if you heard the other video, you'll also be able to hear this. So this is a video about the Milgram experiment. And I think it's helpful because you're actually going to see episodes of the experiment taking place. You can hear it, yes?
When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University. It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator. Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock,
and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is a word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts. And you increase the shock 1 step on each error.
That is incorrect. This one will be 195 volts.
The learner was hidden from the teacher by a partition.
Of course, this was all a simulation. Nothing was really happening. But the learner made very convincing sounds of pain as the shocks increased.
This will be at 3:30.
And Milgram found, surprisingly and rather horrifyingly, that the majority of people would actually go right to the very highest level if there was some pressure from a man in a white coat who said things like,
"It's absolutely essential that you continue. Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My eyes bother me.
Go on.
Let me out.
in fact, about 65% of the people who he studied, who were normal volunteers from the ordinary population, actually gave the maximum number of volts.
This man was one of those 65%.
This one will be 195 volts. The correct one. Let me out of here. Slow. Dance. Let me out of here. My heart bothers me. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Just want to, just in case you miss it, the learner is arguing or is saying my heart is bothering me, that I have a heart condition, and he begs to leave. And of course, the subject is looking at the experimenter, who tells him to keep going.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My eyes bother me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out. Responsible for it. Red. That is incorrect. This will be at 3:30. The correct phrase is rich
Let me out of
boy.
here. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out, I tell you. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me
The
here.
next phrase is
Let me
fast.
out. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Bird,
Let me out.
car, train, plane.
Eventually, the learner pretended to be unconscious.
Continue, teacher.
That is incorrect. This will be 3:45. The correct.
So again, I just want to underline what's going on here. The person, as far as the teacher is concerned, the person may be dead or unconscious, but rather than going in and seeing what's happening or just getting up and leaving, he's still going on with increasing levels of shock because the learner is not responding to the questions. And you understand, learner is not actually getting a shock.
Correct answer is fast bird.
What we learned from that experiment is that people will actually do an awful lot when they're put under pressure from authority figures. And the problem is, of course, that when we obey the unjust authority figure, the person who gives us immoral commands, then, of course, awful things can go wrong.
Whoa.
Let me see if I can go to the next slide. Okay. Yeah. So when I usually don't show that video, you can find online videos of this taking place. And this is kind of an illustration of the teacher is on one side, the learner is on the other side, and everybody have a clear idea of what we just saw. Yeah. And so this is what the shock generator looked like, and it went from slight shock, up to dangerous severe shock, 450 volts. This is I think a very interesting slide. It shows the strength of shock versus the percentage of people who would go up to that level. And although the initial study was on, men, they did it on women and so on. And I'll show one more chart, which is interesting. So essentially everyone went up to like 135 volts. And as you went to higher and higher levels, some people would say, no, I'm just not doing this. So, but the astounding thing is that 65% of the participants actually went up to 450 volts and went up to a place where the person was no longer responding. They kept giving more and more shocks. And one of the things that I really learned from that video is, rather than just having the guy who was supposedly being shocked, be an actor and responding, they actually taped it so every case was exactly the same. So they would be correcting for, how convincing the person might be, if you understand where I'm going with this.
Interesting to think. I'm wondering how it was, what the outcome was for those who, when she mentioned there was all this control, what happened to them?
So watch this. This is the original setup. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, I'm just thinking to myself, that's what's happening in our country right this minute.
Oh, yes.
With President Trump involved.
Okay, I don't want to get I don't want to get openly into politics, but we can see the power of authority, and this is actually illustrated more in this chart. So the question is, what percentage of subjects would continue giving shocks up to 450 volts? Okay, so I don't know if someone is going in. Oh yeah, Jerry is trying to get back in. Okay, so in the original setup of the experiment, it was 65%, and that was in a university sort of laboratory setting. If the office building if the experiment was in an office rather than a laboratory setting, the fraction of people that would go up to the full shock level was 48%. If the teacher could see the learner rather than being on the other side of a wall, it went down to 40%. If the teacher actually held the learner's hand onto the plate to get the shock, much more intimately involved, goes down to 30%. If the experimenter, the guy in the white coat, left and was just on the telephone giving instructions, it went down to 23%. If the experimenter leaves and just leaves another ordinary person there to give the instructions, it went down to 20%. If the teacher would see other people saying, "No, I'm not going to go any further," and the other person left, then the fraction of the number of people who went up to full voltage was 10%. And if the teacher just chose the shock level, that only 3% went up to the full level. Because what Milgram was saying was he was really interested in the effect of an authority figure. Because of course that's what we had, certainly, and I would say there was huge controversy in this experiment, because I think even Milgram said he expected maybe 10% or 5% of people would go all the way up to the maximum level. And basically what this was saying was ordinary folks in New Haven had the same things within them that the Nazis did. The same tendency to obey authority figures. Alan.
Exactly. So this is maybe a general military kind of motivation thing, but I'm thinking of Hamas, right? So 5,000 people were oriented to do terrible things on October 7th. Mm-hmm. Those 5,000 people didn't wake up kindly a few weeks before. They were worked with to develop with the issue of authority, as you're describing it, ended up being successfully convincing 5,000 people to do all the bad things that they did on October 7th. Is that relevant to what we're discussing?
Well, I think it's relevant, but I also think, what happened with Hamas is generations of hatred and being taught that Jews are less than human, and that Jews really want to take over their land and kill all of us.
So this is not the same as the average New Haven citizens. This has already been some conditioning had been prepared over time.
Yes, and we talk about in the world of interfaith work, the teachings that the Jews murdered Jesus and were responsible for the death of Jesus. It was responsible. I mean, I gave this class on the history of anti-Semitism. So you had Egyptian anti-Semitism, you had Greek anti-Semitism, Roman anti-Semitism, Christian anti-Semitism, Muslim, leftist anti-Semitism, Muslim anti-Semitism. Today we have the anti-Semitism of the far right, and we have the anti-Semitism of the far left. So you have all these different ideologies, but certainly the ideology that you're taught will influence your perspective. So it's not only what Milgram was trying to do. One of the reasons, I know, Paul, you're a psychologist. One of the reasons I love psychological experiments is the elegance of the design to try and remove other elements. So here they were just testing authority. And by the way, the response of men and women were roughly the same in this experiment, which I found kind of surprising.
How about age? Was age a factor?
I don't recall.
Okay.
I'm not sure they tested for it. Paul.
I just want to say that I was involved in an experiment like that in graduate school. And we had to choose who the experimenter was going to be that was going to take us through this experiment. And some of the people chose their mother or father to be the person who's going to dictate the punishment. And some people had a very bad mother or father, and they would listen to what the experimenter was saying, and they did the shock because the mother or father was saying, "You better do this, you better do it," and they didn't stop. They didn't stop even with a high shock. They didn't stop because they were afraid.
So they were reproducing the Milgram experiment?
Yes, and that's what Donald Trump does to all the people under him.
I don't want to get into politics.
Okay,
but that's what. But it certainly is the effect of authority.
It is,
and which is what Milgram was checking on.
Exactly.
And the other thing I led to understand, but I'm not sure this is true, that many of the people, of course, at the end and in some of the videos, if you Google, Milgram experiment or go to YouTube, you'll see lots of videos, and you'll see people nervously laughing, and then also the relief when they find out that the person wasn't being shocked at all. But my understanding was there was a pretty significant reaction in some people who walked out of there and realized what they had just done.
Exactly. That's perfect. That's right. Exactly.
And there's another experiment which is similar. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Stanford prison barracks experiment, where basically at Stanford in California, they over like winter break or spring break, they assigned different students the role of prison guards and prisoners, and it was random. And they did actually use some psychological input, and they kicked people out that seemed to enjoy one role or the other too much. I don't remember the details, but it only went on for about a week or 10 days, and they stopped it because the guards got increasingly vicious in the way they were treating their fellow students, because they really got into this role.
Yes.
And the most astounding thing about that experiment was apparently the guards found out that the prisoners were planning an escape.
Whoa.
And so the guards with the experimenters, with the psychologists who were conducting the test, contacted prison authorities to ask about how they should prevent an escape. And then the psychologists realized, or with reviewers, realized that even the people managing the experiment got sucked into the guard role. So I think it's just very important for us to understand, to me, the powerful significance of the Milgram experiment is that we have it within us. I think it's literally in our DNA.
Yes, it is. It is.
And it can be in politics, it can be in bullying, it can be In the military, respect for authority is the way it works. So there's good and bad, but this is very much part of our nature. And so that's, on the free will side of this discussion, I wanted to basically say it's clear that we don't only do good things, that under certain circumstances, all of us have the ability and the propensity to really mistreat, to do evil things, and not just people who are clinically sick or deranged. These are ordinary New Haven folks.
I'm thinking about a documentary that I watched several years ago where Paula Zahn was interviewing different people, right? One of them was Ron Lauder, and he was saying think about the message, look at the resilience of the people who got out of Auschwitz, and, look at their strength now, how they are, it's really special.
And the point of that is?
Well, I mean, that they found somehow, as traumatic as it was for them, I just think that there was a positive.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually the message of the guy who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl. But most people that went into the concentration camps never came out.
Right.
And every concentration camp guard was a volunteer. No one was forced to be a concentration camp guard, realizing that was probably a better form of service than going to the Russian front and fighting the Russians. It was pretty easy duty. I mean, even though you were mass murdering people, it was physically safe, but the concentration camp guards were volunteers. So it is sobering. So that to me underlines free will. And next time we'll pick up on the question of tragedy. Okay, Paul.
Yeah, just to end this for me, I wanted to tell a little story about a farmer who was driving his tractor, and he passed a bunch of trees. And he said to himself, "Do trees poop?" And he said to himself, "Yeah, they must be. Where did number 2 pencils come from?"
Oh, God. That's not the worst one I've heard, but it's not bad. Jim.
Just for everybody else, Rabbi and I were emailing back because I was at lectures. And at one point, when we were talking about the Big Bang, it might have been Paul, I don't remember. Somebody said, "What happened before the Big Bang?" And Rabbi said, no, nothing happened before the Big Bang. Rabbi said, no, you can't say nothing. There was energy or something, as I recall you saying that.
If I said it, I misspoke. The answer is, it's a meaningless question.
No, not what existed before the Big Bang.
Meaningless question. Now, I think actually you posed it are you posing this in the context of physics and cosmology or Genesis?
Physics and cosmology.
Okay. Time begins. Hold on. Time begins with the Big Bang. So there is no before the Big Bang. So it's a meaningless question. And the way I illustrate it, because that doesn't seem to satisfy anyone, here's my illustration. Okay, Jim, suppose you're standing on the North Pole, on the very apex of the North Pole. And now I tell you, Jim, take a step to the east. Can you do that?
No.
Oh, every direction is south, right?
Yeah.
So that command is a meaningless command. If you're standing on the North Pole, there is no east.
Haven't I heard physicists say that it depends on how you define nothing? Or what?
I don't know. I can imagine a physicist saying that. But what I would say is our understanding of cosmology is that time begins with the Big Bang. So there is no before the Big Bang. It's a meaningless question.
Okay.
It's kind of like the question, here's another good one. Can God make a rock so heavy that God can't move it.
Or lift it. Yeah.
And there's even a song, when an irresistible force such as me, meets an old immovable object like you, or something, that you can bet as sure as you live, something's got to give, something's got to give, something's got to give. So you can't have an irresistible force and an immovable object in the same universe, right? If you have one, you can't have the other. So you can make a grammatical statement, like, can God make a rock so heavy that God can't lift it? You can state that as a grammatical question, but the question is meaningless. And from the standpoint of physics, the question, what happened before the Big Bang, is a meaningless question.
Okay.
Okay. The interesting question is in Genesis, what's going on? And there, we can argue, because it says in the beginning, is it in the beginning or when God began to create the universe? A ruach, a spirit of God, hovered over the face of the deep, and then God said, "Let there be light." And so, that's an interesting question. Is it creation from nothing? Is it creation from something? The rabbis are going to comment all over the place on that. Les.
Is this accepted, the Big Bang, in physics now as being reality?
So this is something else that I think is an important thing to appreciate about science. There is no such thing in science as certainty. There are theories.
Right.
And you continually measure theories against your observations of the universe. So an accepted theory is one that explains the data that you have, and you continue doing tests. And if the theory continues to explain the results of the tests, you have continued confidence in the possibility that that theory adequately describes the universe. And if you have, so you can do 1 million experiments, it still doesn't convince you of the absolute certainty of a theory, but one experiment can convince you of the untruth of a theory. So I would say the Big Bang is in that world. I'm not aware of any experimental results which contradict the Big Bang.
Am I correct? I heard someone say, and I couldn't believe it, that it started off like the size of my thumb, and this little thing exploded and became the universe.
I think my sense is much smaller than your thumb.
Really?
And became all planets and everything.
Yeah. All the mass and energy is contained in that primordial atom.
Impossible. That's not even possible.
It's
too tiny to think about. It's too tiny to think about.
Yeah. So if it's his thumb, that makes it possible.
No,
but anyway, so that's the understanding. Is you have, so basically what you have is, the universe, an atom is mostly space. I wish I had these figures in my head. If we were standing at a nucleus, the closest electron might be miles away, if you up the scale. Atoms are mostly empty space. So basically what you have at the beginning of the universe is all the elementary particles are jammed together. And also there's just a lot of energy there. And it may just be all energy jammed together. And then the interesting question is, what causes it to explode? And there's, I think in the world of cosmology, it's called the inflation theory, that there's something that happens that causes the Big Bang to take place. And of course, in Judaism, it's God says, "Let there be light." And so the primordial atom has to expand to the point where it's no longer a black hole, and now you can actually have light escaping from it. So I read a passage from Nachmanides last time where he describes it as big as a mustard seed, which is as small as he could imagine, in the 1400s. So yeah, I mean it's fantastic.
Where did empty space come from?
I don't know what you mean by where did empty space come from.
I mean, if empty space is filled with something, there must be empty space around to fill it. So what happened?
Space begins with the Big Bang. So before the Big Bang, not only did time begins with the Big Bang, but space exists. Space is created with the Big Bang. Don't ask me to explain this
That's too hard
deeply
to
because I
even think
can't.
about.
But you can ask the question, suppose I was 1,000,000 miles away from the Big Bang and watching it. That's a meaningless statement because there is no 1,000,000 miles away from the Big Bang, because before the Big Bang, there was no space. So time and space begin with the Big Bang.
Wow. Whoa. Oh, that's my head is busting open here.
Oh, good.
I can't,
That's why we wear yarmulkes, to keep our heads.
I can't even think of something like that. It doesn't exist. How can you
No, it
think of
doesn't.
something
No,
that
the
wasn't there
amazing
all of a sudden
thing,
gets there?
Paul, the amazing thing is that it does exist.
Ay,
And
ay, ay.
Einstein said, one of my favorite quotes from Einstein is, the most incomprehensible thing in the universe is that it's comprehensible.
Ay, my God.
So imagine here we are with our limited brain power, and we can imagine and investigate and test theories about what happened 13.8 billion years ago in the first few microseconds of the existence of the universe. And we can analyze the physics and then test to see whether that actually happened. And again, this is an area that I can barely understand. I don't know if you've ever heard of the discussion of the background microwave. It's kind of cosmic microwave radiation variations. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of this.
No.
So basically what you have is the Big Bang. Question is, why wasn't it perfectly uniform and just leading to dust? There had to be irregularities in it. And that allowed planets to form and so on. And if that's true, when you measure the temperature of deep space, really deep space, you would find some variations. And the temperature is communicated to us through microwave radiation, okay? Just like, temperature, heat, okay, heat, right? Heat, hot, I don't know, something hot. Let's say this was boiling water, and I hold my hand here and I can sense that it's hot. Everybody with me?
Yeah.
The heat is being transmitted by electromagnetic radiation.
Right.
Okay. Infrared radiation. Okay. You have a space heater, it's glowing red, and you feel the heat, right? Everybody with me? So that's a certain wavelength. As we get cooler and cooler, the wavelengths get bigger and bigger, and microwave radiations are a couple of inches, in wavelength. So they were doing these studies of measuring microwave radiation in deep space, and they were coming up with some strange results. And initially they thought it was birds frapping in the microwave receptors, because these are huge, like ears. And when they filtered it all out, no, they found out it was real. And there's a pattern there that we actually see, and we're actually measuring the temperature of deep space as it existed 13 billion years ago, because that's how long it took for the microwaves to reach us. And that matches what the physics would predict with the Big Bang. So again, more and more experiments that are consistent with the Big Bang theory. So I would say I'm not aware of, that there's still always arguments, and people are proposing experiments, and if this experiment succeeds or fails, it will change theory. I mean, I think I spoke about this. There's a very famous experiment with Einstein. One of Einstein's predictions in general relativity is that light bends with gravitational waves. Okay, like if you throw a baseball, it comes down to Earth, right? Gravity affects the path of a baseball. You wouldn't think gravity would affect the path of light, but at very high gravitational levels, there is some interaction. That's the prediction. That's Einstein's prediction. Okay, no way in the world to test it. Okay, but he comes out with this prediction. And then I don't know if he or someone else came up with the idea of how we can test this theory. The answer is during a total solar eclipse.
Wow.
And how do we do it in total solar eclipse? Think about it. You're looking up at the sky. The sky is dark. You see stars. It's one of the amazing things. You see stars coming out. Now, if you can photograph stars that are close to the sun, you know from star charts where that star should be, right? But if that star's light is passing close to the sun, because the sun has a very powerful gravitational field, it should deflect the light a little bit,
Yeah,
and the location of that star should shift like
just a little bit.
hundredths of a degree,
Right.
tiny, tiny shifts. So in 1913, I think it was 1913, or maybe it was a little later, I can't remember. It was there was a story about Einstein and one of the expeditions that interfered with World War I. They didn't like the idea of German scientists traveling to where this eclipse was going to be. They photographed an eclipse. Now, in those days, you photographed it, you had plates, you had to get them developed. I mean, it's not, this is like, the 20s, let's say. And it took weeks for them to develop the plates and to almost microscopically examine the star field relative to what you would expect. And it absolutely confirmed Einstein's prediction.
Hey.
And so that's a perfect example. Here is something that's absolutely counterintuitive, that light would bend with gravitation. And here's a way to test it. And if the light bends as predicted, general relativity is, it's an experiment confirming it. And if it doesn't bend, then you have to come up with another theory.
Hey.
And they asked Einstein, because he became instantly the most famous scientist in the world. And they asked him, Professor Einstein, suppose the light hadn't bent. And his answer was, then I would feel sorry for God because I know I'm right. That is chutzpah. Yeah. So Paul, you had something else you wanted to add?
Last question I have, can there be another Big Bang someplace?
There's some discussion about that. If there's a big crunch, would it lead to another Big Bang? But
Yeah.
you would be able to tell that it wasn't the first one, because I believe there's ways of experimentally understanding that the Big Bang we have is the first one. But it's billions of years in the future.
Wow.
Yeah, worry about your Social Security. Don't worry about another Big Bang. Okay, I'm going to end the recording.